1 Corinthians chapter 9. It's good to see you tonight. Thankful for each one gathered here. Appreciate very much your presence and thankful for this opportunity. It's been good for me to go back through this book. It's given me an excuse, an opportunity to go back and to think in some deliberate way about this book that, you know, maybe like you, I first read it many years ago, and it's certainly been on my mind through the years. It is a challenging book in so many ways, but it's also a book that brings a lot of blessings and that teaches us a great deal about God's expectation, about grace, about works, about making right choices, about the importance of being spiritual people. And so for a lot of reasons, I'm thankful to have had this opportunity to go back again through 1 Corinthians, and I appreciate your patience and your interest in this study. 1 Corinthians chapter 9 is where we'll start tonight. I think 8, 9, and 10 go together. We were looking this morning at chapter 8, and where Paul has a good bit to say about liberty and about responsibility and the responsibility we have to be our brother's keeper. And I think Paul, in what we call the 9th chapter, of course we divide the book into chapters and verses, but in chapter 9, Paul continues a discussion of this theme in a very personal way. You know, back in chapter 8, he had started off with the question, what about things sacrificed to idols? A very practical question in a place like Corinth, where there was so much of that was going around. We looked this morning at how that archaeology has shown that the idolatrous temples were right next door to the meat markets. There was a reason for that. There was so much meat that was offered to these idols, and the priest couldn't use it all, so they would sell it to the meat markets, and they would sell it to the general public. A lot of that kind of thing floating around. What's the Christian's responsibility in such a situation, and what should they do? There were all kinds of choices to be made, and Paul warned in the first part of this section in chapter 8 about the danger of counting too much on knowledge and forgetting charity. And so Paul, in his own practice, certainly had to make tough choices and to not forget charity in reference to his own conduct. We go to 1 Corinthians 9 in verse 1, beginning from the old translation. Paul begins with the question, am I not an apostle? Am I not free? Have I not seen Jesus Christ our Lord? Are not ye my work in the Lord? If I be not an apostle unto others, yet doubtless I am to you. For the seal of mine apostleship are ye in the Lord. Mine answer to them that examine me is this: have we not power to eat and drink? Have we not power to lead about a sister, a wife, as well as the other apostles, and the brethren of the Lord, and Cephas? Or I only and Barnabas, have we not power to forbear working? It seems evident when you read this that Paul is addressing a problem that we see larger in the letter and in the letter we call 2 Corinthians. And that is that there were enemies working at Corinth, enemies that were trying to convince the Corinthians not to listen to Paul, enemies that were trying to suggest that somehow Paul was not really a full apostle, he was somehow lesser. And they would use any slanderous charge they could to try and destroy Paul's influence at Corinth. Look at 2 Corinthians chapter 11, just as an example. 2 Corinthians 11 and verse 1, Paul in that letter writes, would to God that you would bear with me a little in my folly, indeed bear with me. For I am jealous over you with a godly jealousy, for I have espoused you to one husband, that I may present you as a chaste virgin to Christ. But I fear, lest by any means as the serpent beguiled Eve through his subtlety, so your minds should be corrupted from the simplicity that is in Christ. For if he that cometh preacheth another Jesus, whom we have not preached, or if you receive another spirit which ye have not received, another gospel that ye have not accepted, ye might bear with him. And then he adds to that, I suppose I'm not a whit behind the chiefest apostles. You can get the idea from that that Paul is concerned about false teachers coming along, slandering Paul, trying to draw the disciples in another direction. And the problem with that is there ain't no other direction except wrong. You know, Paul is not trying to have his own following. Paul is the apostle of the Lord. You reject him, you reject Christ, you reject everything. So Paul, out of his love for them, that's what he says here, my only concern is that I might have the pleasure of seeing you as a chaste virgin, betrothed to Christ and married to Christ. And I don't want somebody else to come along and sing some sweet song and wind up causing you to commit adultery. Look in the 12th chapter of the same 2 Corinthians 11. We could read the whole thing and do so with profit, but Paul writes, what I do, that I will do, that I may cut off occasion from them which desire occasion, that wherein they glory, they may be found even as we. For such are false apostles, deceitful workers, transforming themselves into the apostles of Christ. And no marvel, for Satan himself is transformed into an angel of light. Therefore, it is no great thing if his ministers be transformed as ministers of righteousness, whose end shall be according to their works. Now, these folks were wicked people, headed for trouble, and they wanted to take the Corinthians with them. But Paul again writes, and he says, verse 18, seeing that many glory after the flesh, I'll glory also. For ye suffer fools gladly, seeing ye yourselves are wise. For ye suffer if a man bring you into bondage, if a man devour you, if a man take of you, if a man exalt himself, if a man smite you on the face. I'm amazed at how you let these guys get away with this. How you let them lie to you and take advantage of you, all the while claiming that we're the ones who are enemies. And I'm amazed you could believe such nonsense. He says, after all, are they ministers of Christ? Verse 23, I speak as a fool, I am more. Any of these guys want to compare credentials with me? You're without excuse. You ought to know better. Back in the 3rd chapter of 2 Corinthians, you know, Paul had, you remember this, he wrote, do we need to commend ourselves to you? Do we need some letter of introduction to you? To you? You're our introduction letter. You're our epistle, known and read of all men. Chiefly declared to be the epistle of Christ, not written with ink, verse 3, but with the Spirit of the living God, not in tables of stone, but in fleshy tables of the heart. If there's anybody in the world that ought to know who we are, it's you, because you found Christ through us. But Paul was concerned about the influence of these wicked men, and he wrote about that in the letter we call 1 Corinthians. Paul's defense here is his sacrificial love for the brethren had been taken for somehow inferiority. Piecing these verses together, what it seems is that the claim was made that because Paul had chosen not to take support from these brethren directly, that his enemies used that as an occasion to suggest, well, he was really guilty about taking money. And he was really not even an apostle, you know. Sometimes you can't win. You know, if he had taken funds directly from them, some would have said, well, he's just in it for the money. And if he didn't take funds from them directly, then they said, well, then he's not really an apostle, not really worthy of. So Paul makes the point, I think, in our passage, in our text here, that they had twisted his sacrificial choice to forego the right he had to be supported by the local church. Or for that matter, in the larger sense, the right he had to a family. He chose a life that made a family difficult to have. He had a right to it, but he was doing the kind of work that made it hard to be a family man. The travel that he had and the difficulties that he would endure out here on the front lines. That he had foregone the right, even sometimes to take secular work that might have paid him more, choosing instead to receive funds from other churches to do them service. If you go back to Acts chapter 18, when Paul came to Corinth, you remember this record, we've read it recently together, and I know you've read it many times before. But in Acts 18, Paul departs from Athens, he comes to Corinth, he finds there a Jewish couple, Aquila and Priscilla, because he was of the same craft, verse 3, he abode with them and wrought. He worked, for by their occupation they were tent makers. And then he reasoned every Sabbath day in the synagogue and persuaded the Jews and the Greeks. And then at some point, verse 5, Silas and Timothy were come to Macedonia. The old translation reads, and Paul was pressed in the Spirit and testified to the Jews that Jesus was Christ. I think some of the translations read a little bit differently, that Paul was, after they came occupied in the Word or with the Word. The implication seems to be that before this time he was preaching and teaching, and he was also making his living with his hands, and then they seem to have brought some support so that he could be devoted fully to the work of preaching and teaching. What part of that is selfish? What part of that is trying to take advantage of the Corinthians? There's just no slander too outrageous for the enemies of truth to throw it at God's people. Don't you know that to be true? I mean, it doesn't make any difference, how a man may bend over backwards. Somebody's going to find some way to be offended by it, some way to criticize it. And that was the case here. Paul was shocked that it seemed to have effect with some of the Corinthians. And so he brings this up, I think, in the context of their question. Their question was, what do we do with this meat sacrificed to idols? What is our relationship with that? What's the proper decision we ought to make about that? And Paul has said in chapter 8, what you ought to do is not just count on what you know, but also charity. Think about what you're doing, not just in reference to yourself, but in reference to others. And then he takes the occasion here in what we call chapter 9 to say, that's the way I've dealt with you all along. I was concerned about you. And the decisions that I made, I was concerned about those hearing the gospel. Not just my wants, what would be convenient for me. But don't doubt for a moment, since somebody had made this an issue, that Paul had not taken directly from the Corinthians, that somehow that said something bad about him. Don't doubt for a minute, I have the right to do so. And that's where we come to the next section, verse 7 of chapter 9. Who serves as a soldier at his own expense? These are rhetorical questions. Who plants a vineyard without eating of its fruits? Who tends a flock without getting some of the milk? Do I say these things on human authority? Doesn't the Scripture also say the same thing? For it is written in the law of Moses, verse 9, you shall not muzzle the ox when it treads out the grain. That's Deuteronomy 25, isn't it? I think. Now, Paul asked the question, did he say that for the oxen's sake? Well, maybe in some sense, but hardly exclusively, not primarily. Does he not certainly speak for our sake, verse 10? It was written for our sake, because the plowman should plow in hope and the thresher should thresh in hope of sharing the crop. It's a fundamental. You don't muzzle the ox that treads out the grain. And so what does that teach us? It teaches us that those, as he says, that work in this realm spiritually have a right to receive for what they do. In 9:11, if we have sown spiritual things among you, is it too much that we reap material things from you? If others share this rightful claim on you, do not we even more? Nevertheless, we have not made use of this right, but we endure anything rather than to put an obstacle in the way of the gospel of Christ. Is it possible that exercising a right can sometimes, this right can sometimes put an obstacle in the way of the hearing of the gospel? I remember an old fellow years ago made a point that stuck with me. I'm not sure I've kept this, but it's something that I've thought about a lot. In reference to preachers in particular, he said, in a lot of cases, a preacher can be much more effective if he makes a little less than people think he's worth. You can't make less than some folks think you're worth. Maybe I've never been mistreated, but I'm just saying, sometimes, and maybe a guy's not worth anything. He ought not to get anything. But there is, I think, a certain truth that Paul has hit on here. You don't want to let receiving stand in the way of the teaching. This is critically important. And I think that's why Paul, I don't know if Paul was going hungry. Paul did sometimes earn his living. Paul received from other churches. 2 Corinthians 11:8, I robbed other churches taking wages of them. But I would not take from those folks I was working for particularly, even though I had a right to, because I was afraid for different reasons it might hinder. He doesn't stop to explain all those reasons why. I suspect it had to do with those false teachers. He was trying to show his dedication as opposed to their greed. But be that as it may, Paul says, don't doubt the fact that there's a right here. But that's his whole point, isn't it, in this context? Sometimes we have a right, but we don't exercise that right for charity's sake, for the betterment of others, for spiritual reasons. Verse 13, print small, I'm sorry, but you can follow along if you can't read it. This is actually the ESV. Do you not know that those who are employed in the temple service get their food from the temple? And those who serve at the altar share in the sacrificial offerings? This is what this image is supposed to show. The priest ate of the altar. The law taught that. In the same way, he says, the Lord commanded that those who proclaim the gospel should get their living by the gospel. I think the old King James reads, those that preach the gospel should live of the gospel. And that's been sometimes misunderstood to mean you ought to practice what you preach. But I think this translation says it more clearly, doesn't it? I think you ought to practice what you preach. My. But what he's saying is that those who preach the gospel have a right to live of their work. If we have sown spiritual things to you, we have a right to reap the carnal things. The right is not under question here, as far as Paul is concerned. But when you might withhold that right, and you might go another direction, this is what he's trying to get them to think about. That there may be good reasons, spiritual reasons, charitable reasons, why it's best not to always exercise our rights for the sake of the gospel, of the teaching, of the hearer. Verse 15 again, verse 19 I should say. No, I'm sorry, verse 15. Verse 15 of chapter 9. But I have not used any of these rights, and I'm not writing this so that they may be applied in my case. He said, I would rather die than let anyone deprive me of my reason for boasting. If I preach the gospel, I have nothing to boast about, for this obligation has been entrusted to me. How terrible it would be for me if I didn't preach the gospel. If I preach voluntarily, I get a reward. If I'm unwilling to do it, I'm still entrusted with that obligation. But here's my reward, he said, that I can preach the gospel free of charge, at least to those who hear it. And so I never resort to demanding my rights when I'm preaching the gospel. And he goes on to expand on that thought about his work in general and his philosophy about trying to reach others with the gospel as a vessel of the gospel. What did he say in 2 Corinthians chapter 4? He said, we have this treasure of the gospel in earthen vessels. That's 2 Corinthians 4, isn't it, verse 7. So he talks here. This is such great material and so important for every Christian, every teacher certainly to think about. All of us. Verse 19. Though I be free from all men, yet I have made myself servant unto all, that I might gain the more. Paul said there's a sense in which I'm a slave to every man. Why? What's your goal? that I might make a following for me, that I might manipulate them into to do it. No, 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 no. So that I might gain them more. That is, gain them for Christ. And then he specifically makes the point, to the Jews I became as a Jew, that I might gain the Jews. And to them that are under the law as under the law, that I might gain them that are under the law. I'll pause there to say it's been a question for me, it still is really. What's the difference between a Jew and somebody under the law? There are smart folks who write about this passage who say, well, there is really no difference. Well, then why did he mention two? I don't think there's got to be some difference, doesn't there? Another suggestion has been maybe this is talking about those who are born Jews as opposed to those who might be proselytes. Could be. One fellow suggested maybe this is those who are Judean Jews as opposed to the scattered. Maybe. But the overall point is, Paul said, sometimes I'm trying to teach people who come from a strict Jewish background. And he said, when I'm with people like that, I try to be sensitive to their sensitivities. I probably wouldn't be eating a pork sandwich when I went over there to talk to them. I'm making that up, of course, but you get the point. Because I know how that would be received. I know the doors that would shut. I know how, I don't have to eat that. I can, but I don't have to. It's a liberty. I'll let that go. Because I'm trying to reach these people. That's my goal. And I'm not trying to be smarter than them. I'm trying to help them. And I might add this point. He didn't add it, but I think we could see this. Let me tell you, when Paul was teaching those folks who were under the law, those were his people. They didn't receive him very well, but boy, he knew those people. He knew how they thought because he had thought that way his whole life until he found Christ. But on the other hand, sometimes you're not teaching people who come from that background. And he said to them that are without law, verse 21, as without law, not being without law to God, but under law to Christ, that I might gain them that are without law. Boy, that parenthetical statement is really powerful, by the way. We're not going to take the time it deserves. We're always under law to Christ. I got brethren who don't think we're under any law. It amazes me. It's shocking. It's horrifying, really. We are under law to Christ. And the apostles were not shy about talking about the law of liberty. The contrast is not between Christ and any law. Many times there's a contrast between Christ and the old law. But clearly, we're under law. And we need to see it and think that way. That's another subject and an important subject. But anyway, what he says here, sometimes I was with those who were without the law of Moses. They did not have those same sensibilities and problems. Maybe they were having the pork sandwich. I didn't act like I was offended by that because I know that's not a matter of the law of Christ. So what I could do is I could be there with them and not make them feel bad because they didn't keep Jewish traditions, because that's not a matter of law. Because I'm trying to win them to Christ. That's what matters. To the weak, I became as weak that I might gain the weak. We talked about this a little bit this morning. When Paul used the word weak, I can't think of an exception. There may be one, but at least predominantly. He's not talking about people weak in their commitment. You know, the weak brother in Romans 14 is not a guy that you've got to, again, beg to read the Bible or beg to pray. He's a guy whose conscience is so strict, it's actually more strict than God's law. He's not a loose-thinking individual. He's not a weak man in that sense. But he's weak in knowledge. He's weak in his understanding. And so Paul said, when I came to those who are weak in their understanding, I likewise went with them as far as I could under law to Christ, that I might gain them. I made myself all things to all men. What did he say? I'm a servant to all. That's what he meant, wasn't it? I make myself all things to all men that I might by all means save some. I wish I could tell you I do that so well. I think most of us struggle in that regard. But that's our goal, is to be as selfless and as ruled by charity as Paul was, as loving as Paul was. He said, this I do for the gospel's sake, that I might be partaker thereof with you. What a great paragraph. And then in 24, verse 24, another great paragraph we're all familiar with. Do you not know that those who run in a race run all, but one receives the prize? Run in such a way that you may obtain it. And everyone who competes for the prize is temperate in all things. They do it to obtain a perishable crown, but we an imperishable crown. Therefore I run thus, not with uncertainty. I fight not as one who beats the air, but I discipline my body and bring it into subjection, lest when I have preached to others, I myself should be disqualified. What a rich passage, what a rich paragraph here. We remember this idea of the dedication of those who competed in the games. We know that today. We think about these Olympians. You know, they are so disciplined in their diet and their exercise, and they have chewing gum for breakfast and water for lunch, and they're working to try to do what? So that they can have a trophy, they can have a medal hung about their neck. Their dedication we can learn from, their commitment, their single-mindedness. Paul said, that's what I want you to focus on, not your liberties, but on the crown that we're after. It's an imperishable crown, not the crown that men would offer. And so I run, not uncertainly. What's the old translation say? Something along that same line. Uncertainly is the same word that he uses there. Not without a goal. I don't forget what I'm after. I don't forget what I'm running for. And he says, he compares it with boxing. So fight I, not as one who beats the air. Maybe you've seen the image of some person supposed to be fighting and they're just wildly swinging at nothing. Paul said, I know what I'm after. I can see clearly what I need, what I want. My aim is to please Christ and to save as many as I can. That's my goal. And so verse 27, in this translation reads, I discipline my body. The old King James is more awkward, but might be more literal. He said, I keep under my body. Best I can figure, this expression, keep under, is from a word which literally means to punch in the face, to punch under the eye. I was telling somebody recently, one of our young fellows that had a wreck, about something that happened to me years ago, and you don't care about all the details of it, but anyway, I had an accident and airbag deployed, and that thing hit me right in the nose. It's been a long time since I've been in a fight. You know, it took me a minute just to realize what had happened because it came out of nowhere. Truly, I hit a manhole cover. I hit a manhole. It was on a street that they were paving, and that thing was about this high off the ground, and it got by a low vehicle, and so it was like hitting a brick wall that was out in the middle of a street somewhere. Anyway, I was stunned by that. Not much fun to get hit in the face. But Paul said, I do that to toughen myself. I work from day to day to day, and I beat my body. Discipline my body seems to be the idea. And I tell myself no. And I don't take the easy road. He said, I discipline like an athlete would, so spiritually. I discipline my mind. And I make it hard on myself to do the wrong thing. That's what it takes. You know, being right is hardly ever something that just happens. There's a concentrated effort. Isn't that the point he's making with us? I know what I'm after, and I'll pay whatever price I have to get there. Because the last thing, the most horrible thought I can have is that I might preach to others and then myself be disqualified. That's the New King James. I don't know what your translation might say. The old King James reads, I might be a castaway. that I might be lost. I think the NIV reads, disqualified from the prize. That almost sounds like once saved, always saved isn't true, doesn't it? I think if the Apostle Paul was concerned about being disqualified, I could put my name on that list. How about you? And I think Paul knew all about the grace of God. He also knew about the judgment of God. More to be said about that, but let me move on to the 10th chapter. And in chapter 10 and verse 1, you have this great historic section where Paul, takes the brothers, he's drawing this particular part of the letter to a conclusion. He says, I want you to remember what you know about the Old Testament Scripture. Moreover, brethren, I would not that ye should be ignorant how that all of our fathers were under the cloud and all passed through the sea. Think about the Exodus. Think about Israel coming to the Red Sea and then going through the Red Sea on the dry land, coming out the other side. They were all baptized unto Moses in the cloud and in the sea. And when they got on the other side, the Egyptian army had been destroyed. Now a new life, the old behind them, now the new ahead of them. And how that God led them through the wilderness. They did all eat the same spiritual food, and they all drank the same spiritual drink. For they drank of that spiritual rock which followed them. And that rock was Christ. It's a remarkable statement, isn't it? We remember how that Moses, more than one occasion, God through Moses brought water forth from the rock, but it was God who did that. The rock is seen as the source of the water, but we know behind that rock was the rock. And he describes him here as Christ. That's the term he uses. He uses that term again in most translations. In verse 9, let us not tempt Christ. And somebody might say, how does that make any sense? Well, you and I know that the one who was born in Bethlehem didn't begin his existence there or when he was conceived. But he was from the beginning, before the beginning. Turn back to John chapter 1. In the beginning was the Word, and the Word was with God, and the Word was God. And the same was in the beginning with God. And then he says in verse 3, all things were made by him, and without him was not anything made that was made. The same point is made in Colossians, isn't it? Colossians chapter 1. I think it is in verse 17. Well, really before that, 15, I guess. He is the image of the invisible God, the firstborn of every creature, for by him, verse 16, were all things created that are in heaven and earth, visible and invisible. So it does not surprise us or shock us or somehow confuse us that Christ would have been there with Israel in the wilderness. All through that experience, Christ was there. In his pre-incarnate nature, he was there as he was working with these people. And he came then to become a man and live for them and die for them and be raised for them. And so this great picture here of Christ being raised, of Christ helping Israel long ago. What a blessed generation it was. But I think he's wanting the Corinthians to see themselves in this picture. They were selected by God. They were baptized. They came out of that water. They likewise were helped along and along. And you'd think, well, their story is that they walked into the promised land and it never rained on Saturday. Everything was... No, that's not how it happened. It's a tragic story. That generation wound up tragic. Verse 5, many of them God was not pleased, for they were overthrown in the wilderness. The vast majority of those people lost. Verse 6, these things were our examples to the intent that we should learn, that we should not lust after evil things as they lusted. Neither be idolaters as some of them, as it is written, the people sat down to eat and drink and rose up to play. Exodus 32. Moses hadn't even gotten down from the mountain with the tablets before they'd already turned away. Verse 8, neither let us commit fornication as some of them committed and fell in one day 23,000. That horrible situation with Moab after God had put Balaam to shame, turned right around and gave in to sin. Verse 9, let us not tempt Christ, God, and the one that of the Godhead that indeed made us and sustains us. Let us not tempt Christ as some of them tempted and were destroyed of serpents. We know that story from Numbers 21, isn't it? Neither, verse 10, murmur ye as some of them also murmured and were destroyed of the destroyer. I think he's talking there about Korah in Numbers 16. So he says here, learn. Because what happened to them, ultimately God recorded so that we might learn from them. Verse 11, these things happened unto them for examples. They are written for our admonition, upon whom the ends of the world are come. We are the ones who experience the end of the age. There's nothing on this earth after us. We saw the Mosaic period. We see now that time of Christ. And then there's the end of it all. So we are the end of the world. That point's made more than one time, isn't it? And so to us, these things are written to admonish us, to bring to mind these important lessons. And here's the lesson. Wherefore, verse 12, wherefore let him that thinks that he stands take heed lest he fall. He's certainly not suggesting that it's wrong to be confident. He's not talking about confidence, is he? He's talking about overconfidence. He's talking about that spirit that just doesn't think they can fall. What did we read in the very first verse we looked at this morning in Romans 8, 1 Corinthians 8 and verse 1? That's where Paul wrote, knowledge puffs up, charity edifies. Knowledge puffs up. Your knowledge will make you feel so secure that you don't have to be careful, and that carelessness will destroy you. Let me say this. He's talking to you. He's talking to me. That's not you, is it? God forbid. We don't think we can fall. We don't have to be careful. The rules don't apply to us. Somebody else needs that, not me. So, verse 13, there's no temptation takes you but such as is common to man. Let me tell you about temptation. You're tried, but other people have been tried in the same situation. But God is faithful, who will not suffer you to be tempted above what you're able to bear, but will with the temptation make also escape that you may be able to bear it. There's a great promise found in that, isn't there? That is, that what we are going through may be hard, but other people have faced it and have overcome it. And that God will never allow us to be tempted beyond what we can take. Let me say it again. God will never allow me to be tempted beyond what I can bear. There will always be a way to do right if I'll choose it. So, his conclusion in verses 14 and 15. Wherefore, my dearly beloved, flee from idolatry. I speak as to wise men, judge what I say. Consider what I'm saying. Flee idolatry. I think that's the context, by the way, of 2 Corinthians 6. We hear this passage read from time to time and applied in all kind of ways. But when Paul in 2 Corinthians 6 writes, be not unequally yoked together with unbelievers. What fellowship has righteousness with unrighteousness? What communion hath light with darkness? What concord, symphonious is the word, symphony. What harmony hath Christ with Belial? What part hath he that believeth with an infidel? What agreement hath the temple of God with idols? I think we're reminded again of what a problem that was at places like Corinth. And he's warning these brethren, you're too casual with idolatry. You don't take it seriously enough. You think your knowledge will protect you from it all, and you're not making careful choices. So what does he say? He says you need to get away from it. You need to be cleansed from all filthiness of the flesh and spirit, perfecting holiness in the fear of God. And that's the point. So back to our text now in 1 Corinthians chapter 10. He says, the cup of blessing which we bless, is it not the communion of the blood of Christ? And the bread which we break, is it not the communion of the body of Christ? When we take the Lord's Supper, communion, fellowship, a fellowship together, yes, but with Christ. When we take the emblems, there's a fellowship there, a communion there. We are many and yet we're one as we take of the one bread. Then he says, think about Israel after the flesh. Those who eat of the sacrifices, don't they partake of the altar? It'd be very strange for a man to say, well, I'm taking of this sacrifice, but I don't believe in Jehovah. Or a man to take the Lord's Supper and say, yes, I take the Lord's Supper. I take it every time, but I don't believe in Christ. Well, you sure look like you do. There's an implied fellowship here. When you partake of this, you're making a statement. We proclaim the Lord's death till he come. We remember that. Well, what am I saying then? Is an idol anything? Or what's offered to an idol anything? What's he talking about here? I think all of this goes back to that passage that we read this morning and we just noted and we said we come back to in chapter 8, 1 Corinthians 8. Where is it? Verse 10. If any man see thee which hast knowledge sit at meat in the idol's temple. There's more than one thing going on here, isn't there? And to some extent we're talking about people eating meats that we don't know where they came from. But there's some people bold enough they're going to go to the idol's temple. That's where the best cuts are, you know. Oh, they serve good food down there. And eat of the idol's temple. Well, you know, there's nothing to an idol. And Paul says, what are you thinking? How do you not see that as inconsistent with your proclamation to be a Christian? Back to our text here, verse 19. What am I saying? An idol's anything? No. But I'll tell you this, verse 20. The things which the Gentiles sacrifice, they sacrifice to demons and not to God. I do not want you to have fellowship with demons. You can't drink of the cup of the Lord and the cup of demons. You can't partake of the Lord's table and the table of demons. Are you just trying to provoke God? Do you not know he's a jealous God? I agree with what one fellow wrote about this, that when a person participates in the cultic meal of the pagan deity, he's actually, though not always intentionally, worshiping Satan. I think the demons get a great deal of joy out of any worship directed anywhere but God. I think that's still true, by the way. We have all this New Age stuff, all the denominations, all the different religions. I think all of that is in one sense devil worship. I don't mean for a moment that everybody who is involved in that thinks of it that way. I don't think these people thought of it that way. But when I engage and participate in that, Paul said to these folks long ago, you cannot take the table of the Lord and the table of the devil. By the way, table of the Lord is not something you put the emblems on. It's the idea of the emblem. It's the bread. The cup of the Lord is not a container. It's the fruit of the vine. It's what you take. It says you can't take the fruit of the vine and the bread of the Lord and then turn around and eat the sacrifice dedicated to these demon-pleasing false idols and think somehow that goes together. It does not. It never will. That's out. He also, in conclusion, talks about some other things. Maybe you don't go down to the idol temple. No, I wouldn't do that. But, you know, this food is all over town. What do we do? So look in verse 23 as we bring this toward a close here. All things are lawful for me, but all things are not expedient. All things are lawful for me, but all things edify not. Let no one seek his own, but every man another's wealth. Love over knowledge, charity over liberty. And so let that be a guide for you. Always under law to Christ, always under law to Christ, but not using our liberty to run over my brother's conscience. So specifically, for example, 10:25, whatever is sold in the meat market. I'm not going to sit down to the idol's temple, but again, who knows where this stuff came from? Eat whatever is sold in the meat market, asking no questions for conscience sake. For the earth is the Lord's and all its fullness. Everything, all this meat ultimately is the creation of God. It's not inherently sinful. You don't have to do an investigation about where every piece of meat came from. That's what Paul said. Verse 27, here's another case. If any of those who do not believe invite you to dinner and you desire to go, eat whatever is put before you and ask no questions for conscience sake. I don't have to interrogate them about where it came from because ultimately there is no inherent wrong in eating meat. It's not inherently sinful. It becomes an issue whenever it's made to be something in honor of an idol. And that's what he says in the next verse. But if anyone says to you, this was offered to idols, do not eat it, for the sake of the one who told you and for conscience sake. For the earth is the Lord's and its fullness. We don't honor an idol. We honor only God. Conscience, I say, not your own, but that of the other. For why is my liberty judged by another man's conscience? But if I partake with thanks, why am I evil spoken of for the food over which I give thanks? A lot of different ideas about what this means. I'll offer my thought and you can correct me. At least consider what I say. I think what he's saying there is, why would I want to in any way take a liberty and wind up making it something that dishonors God and that brings reproach upon his name? That would be tragic as far as he's concerned. And so if it is put before my face that somehow this is connected with idolatry, I want no part of idolatry. I don't want that message to come forward. So here are several different cases, different courses, but in each I think we have the same thing. We're looking to honor God and to never in any way hinder his word in the minds of others by our actions. So the last words, and we'll close with this. In verse 31, we are godly in all things. What does it mean to be godly? We've talked about that word many times. And the point's been made before that godliness is not so much godlikeness, although we need to be godlike. It's Godwardness, a Godward attitude. It's the man who in everything that he does, he takes a job, where he's going to go to school, who he's going to marry, how he's going to dress, how he's going to talk, everything that he does, it's always what's the will of God about this matter? How does he look at this? How will this affect my relationship with him? Everything. And I think the word is not used, but that's exactly what he's talking about here as he closes this section. Wherefore, whether you eat or drink or whatever you do, do all to the glory of God. Give no offense either to the Jews or the Greeks or the church of God. Doesn't leave many people out, does it? I don't care whether they're brethren, whether they're not brethren, whether they're Jews, whether they're Greeks. I don't want to do anything that will hinder the message of the gospel or dishonor God in any way or in any way derail people from their interest in what's right or their understanding of truth. That's a big job. But he adds this, just as I also. Paul said, I know it's a big job because I live it every day too. Just as I also please all men in all things, not seeking my own profit, but the profit of many, that they may be saved. And that's right. Well, if you feel the weight of this lesson, then join the club, because I do too. And we'll just have to leave it to our conscience to find out all the ways we apply these principles. But I do hope and pray that it's something that we will be renewed in our zeal to put into practice. And I appreciate the very kind way you've listened. Please do get out your songbooks and turn to the number that's been selected. if it be your desire tonight to obey the Lord, I think one thing this passage has taught me and reminded me of is there's no part of my life that the Lord does not intend to be Lord over. Christianity can never be a part of my life. It is every part of my life. It affects everything, or it's not real. So come with your eyes open, but come. And I'll promise you, it's a lot better to serve the Lord than it is to serve the devil. So why not tonight come and serve a Lord who loves you? He intends to make us over, but he is going to do that for our good also. So why not tonight? Come forward. Confess Christ as Lord. Come in repentance. Be baptized into Christ. Be raised to walk in newness of life. Maybe as one who is a child of God. If you've made that commitment but you've not been faithful to it, then why not tonight return to him? And if we can help you in any way, let us know how right now while we stand, while we sing.